The world we live in, with its global trade, massive international banks, and political alliances, it didn't just happen by accident. Nope, it was designed. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the blueprint for our modern global order, a system that was literally forged in the fires of war, tested by competing ideas, and is still changing all the time. Let's get right into it.
So try to picture the world in 1945. After two absolutely devastating world wars and a global depression that crippled everyone, the old way of doing things was just shattered. The countries that won the war knew they couldn't just rewind the clock. They needed a whole new blueprint, a new operating manual to stop another disaster from happening and to manage a global economy that was basically in ruins. The big question was, what would that new manual even look like?
All right, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to walk through 5 key chapters. We'll kick things off with the West's original blueprint. Then we'll look at the completely different socialist vision that competed with it. After that, we'll dive into the Third World's demand for a fairer system, the boom of globalization after the Cold War, and finally, we'll look at the super important political role of the United States through it all.
Okay, so our story really starts with the winners of the war, led by the United States. Their big idea was to build a new world order based on liberal principles, things like free trade, open markets, and international law. The core belief was actually pretty simple. If countries were all economically tangled up together, they'd be a whole lot less likely to go to war with each other again.
And man, they moved fast. Just look at this timeline. In just a handful of years, the core pillars of the system we have today were put in place. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 was basically the starting gun, and it created 2 economic giants, the IMF and the World Bank. A year later, the UN was created to handle the political side of things, and by '48, GATT was signed to lay down the rules for global trade.
So what was the IMF's job in all this? Well, the easiest way to think about it is like the world's financial fighter. Its whole purpose was to keep currency exchange rates stable and to give short-term loans to countries that were in financial trouble. The idea was to stop one country's crisis from turning into a global meltdown.
And what about the World Bank? Okay, if the IMF was the firefighter, the World Bank was the construction crew. Its official name, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, pretty much says it all. Its job was all about the long-term funding, huge projects to rebuild countries destroyed by the war, and, later on, to help develop the economies of newly independent nations.
But here's the thing. This capitalist blueprint wasn't the only game in town. Not by a long shot. The Soviet Union and its allies, they had a completely different vision for the world, built on a totally different set of principles.
So in 1949, the Soviets created their very own economic club, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMEA for short. This was a direct answer to the West system. Its whole goal was to coordinate and stitch together the state-controlled economies of the Eastern Bloc, essentially creating a parallel economic universe.
Now this is where you can really see the massive ideological divide. On one side, the West was all about free markets and connecting the entire globe through trade. On the other side, the East was all about centralized state planning and being economically self-sufficient within their own bloc. We're talking 2 totally competing models, 2 completely different visions for where the world should go.
Now, while this Cold War was raging, a brand new voice started to get louder. Dozens of newly independent nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, what people started calling the Third World, began to argue that the whole global economic system was basically rigged against them.
This frustration gave birth to a really powerful idea called dependency theory. Thinkers like A.G. Frank made a pretty radical argument. They said the wealth of the First World wasn't some happy accident, and the poverty of the Third World wasn't because they were behind. No, they were 2 sides of the same coin. The rich were rich because the poor were kept poor.
This diagram does a great job of breaking it down. So, the theory splits the world into a wealthy core and a poor periphery. The job of the periphery is to provide cheap raw materials and cheap labor to the core. Then, the core uses that to manufacture expensive, high-value goods and sells them back at a huge profit. It creates this cycle that locks in the system, permanently benefiting the rich nations at the expense of the poorer ones.
And what's crucial here is that this wasn't just some academic theory. It became a political rallying cry. At the United Nations in the 1970s, a whole coalition of developing countries banded together to demand a new international economic order. Their goal was, nothing less than to completely rewrite the rules of the global economy. But those demands for a new order, they pretty much fell on deaf ears.
And then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that old ideological competition just ended. The Western capitalist model became the undisputed champ, the only system left standing, and that kicked off what we now call the modern age of globalization.
So the engine for this new globalized era was a supercharged trade system. That old GATT agreement, which has just been a temporary set of rules for decades, it evolved into something way more powerful. In 1995, it was replaced by a permanent, muscular institution, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which had real teeth to enforce global trade rules.
But the WTO almost immediately became a lightning rod for criticism. Protesters and critics argued that its rulings always seemed to prioritize corporate profits over national laws designed to protect the environment, public health, or workers' rights. The main accusation was that this new age of globalization just wasn't delivering on its promises for most of the people on the planet.
Now, through this entire economic saga, from Bretton Woods through the Cold War and into the age of globalization, there's been one institution that has acted as the political anchor for the whole international system, and that's the United Nations.
We really can't forget its founding mission. While the IMF and the World Bank were built to prevent economic chaos, the UN's goal was even bigger, more fundamental, to stop another world war. Its charter commits every single member to that powerful pledge for peace.
And to try and achieve this, the UN has a pretty complex structure. You've got the General Assembly, which is kind of like a world parliament where every country gets a voice. But the real power to authorize action, that lies with the Security Council. And alongside them, you have the World Court for legal fights and a whole bunch of other bodies coordinating everything from social development to the UN's daily grind. This is the political scaffolding that tries to hold the entire global system together.
So, when you look at it all, from that post-war agreement through a massive ideological conflict and into an era of controversial globalization, our global order has never, ever stood still. It has always been shaped by power, by big ideas, and by crises. And that leaves us with one final, really crucial question to think about. In a world that's facing all new kinds of challenges, what's the next chapter in this story going to look like?